something else, you need to get my approval first. So, as you already know, Indiana Jones has been ruled out. So, trying to think of other, lots of World War II films made in the last 20 years are out. Because I don't think they're nearly as interesting as the ones made during and right after the war. If you guys remember, wouldn't mind taking your hats off, by the way. Okay, make sure your phones are off too, please. All right. And how about those New England Patriots? Okay. It's been a heck of a weekend. All right. What I want to do today is talk about the United States and Britain. And to talk about the different approaches they take or the different roads or paths they take to having, in some senses, a hands-off relationship to what's going on in the rest of the world, particularly in Europe. One of the things that's very interesting is that American isolationism, as we'll talk about, American insistence on American neutrality is going to be very much concerned with American entry or potential American entry into a war in Europe. Not a lot of people in the 1930s talking about America first, talking about the need to keep America out of foreign entanglements. Not a lot of them are thinking about Japan. That's the first thing we should stress. People like Roosevelt, people in the State Department, people in the War Department, as it used to be called, are thinking about Japan. But public perception of war, public perception of the possibility of war, tends to focus on Europe. So we will talk a little bit about American ideas about Japan during this, during today. We're going to spend most of the time talking about how Britain and the United States see Europe and see their relationship to Europe. And I've already hinted at a few things. That is, in both Britain and the United States, and I do this for one very specific reason, is that there is often, and even to this day, there is this very sort of politically convenient term used called appeasement. That is, it's often trotted out when someone wants to invade someone else. The idea being that if you don't set a good example, if you don't, sort of take on the dictator, take on the tyrant, insert blank here, you are appeasing them. And it's used especially in American political discourse to indicate that someone is weak, that someone is cowardly. And I want to put today this idea of appeasement into a greater context for you. Appeasement is used also because appeasement is very much a word associated with British diplomacy in the 1930s. Diplomacy is seen as ultimately selling out to Hitler, abandoning places like Czechoslovakia out of weakness and fear. The word appeasement was used to describe it then. It's used now to describe the idea of sort of going soft or letting someone get away with something. One of the reasons that people continue to use this word appeasement is that it conveniently not only paints your political opponent as sort of weak or cowardly or willing to trade away certain things for physical safety, but it also basically implies that the person you're giving into, or the person that is being appeased, is Hitler. That is, it's a little sort of sleight of hand, but when people say, oh, you can't appease fill in the blank, Saddam Hussein, Vladimir Putin, I don't know, somebody, anyone, what you're doing is you're saying, all you're doing here is appeasing Hitler. Appeasement means a very specific thing in political language. It means caving in, it means caving into Hitler. There's a couple of interesting facts that need to go into this to contextualize it, and I think that's why, or I know, that's why today, when I talk about British foreign policy, I'm also going to talk about American foreign policy. Because there is, oftentimes in American political circles, and even sort of American popular memory, this idea that the Americans were absolutely sort of, gung-ho to take on Hitler. Or the Americans understood that Hitler represented this threat to civilization. Some did. Some, like Franklin Delano Roosevelt, took it very seriously. Others were not so eager. And the idea of an America that was eager to take on the Nazi threat is a complete historical misrepresentation. Instead, it's the United States which, even in 1941, before Pearl Harbor, was still starkly divided over what course American foreign policy should take. With those who continue to hold to the idea that America should pursue a policy of neutrality. So when you think about appeasement, and people sort of, this idea that sort of the British are appeasing Hitler in the 1930s, don't think of it in terms of, well, the Americans are there to, sort of take on the Germans from the early 1930s on. That's a false comparison. In Britain and the United States, you have two different reactions to World War I, but both produce this idea of sort of trying to stay out of, or trying to prevent getting entangled in another war very soon. For the British, we've already talked about. In Britain, there is a huge human sacrifice out of the war. There is a sense of conflict at the end of the war about what exactly has happened, what exactly has been accomplished. There are visible reminders of the war. Disabled veterans, unemployed veterans, the ruination, or at least not the ruination, the severe reduction in influence of the British financial and industrial power in the world. In the United States, it's much less a sense of a direct sacrifice that is seen, but it's more a sense that the war didn't do anything for the United States, that the United States was in essence sort of tricked into or duped into going to war, whether by politicians or by industrialists. In the United States, in the 1920s and the 1930s, it is very popular to argue that this war, which did very little, had been all about the financiers who wanted to loan money to the fighting powers and the industrialists who wanted to supply weapons to the American army and to others. That in essence, the war had been fought for the interests of a small elite. And in 1920, and perhaps the most significant of these early stances on neutrality in the United States, in 1920, the American Senate, of course, refuses to ratify the Treaty of Versailles. That is, the Senate must ratify all treaties signed by the President, Woodrow Wilson, by then incapacitated by a stroke, had signed it, but significant opposition existed, led by Republicans like Henry Cabot Lodge, the senator from Massachusetts, who basically said, we should not get involved in European quarrels. We did. We lost tens of thousands of soldiers. What is the use? What has it done? What has it solved? In 1920, the American Senate rejects the Versailles Treaty, rejects in particular its centerpiece, the League of Nations. The League of Nations will exist through the 20s and 30s, but it is never nearly as strong as it might have been had the Americans participated. For Americans, the idea was that their interests lay elsewhere, promoting domestic economic growth, protecting spheres of influence in the Caribbean, in Latin and South America, and in parts of the Pacific. American influence or American interest in Europe were fairly sharply, were sort of, how should I put it? We're not very great. We're certainly not compelling. So you have in the United States this idea that it's not in our interest, it's not in our immediate future to consider our position in Europe or consider our relationship with Europe and with the balance of power in Europe. There's one other thing about Britain. If the Americans are concerned with sort of cultivating what they have, expanding the American presence in the Western Hemisphere, one other thing comes to mind. That is that the British are not only concerned about the physical cost of the war, the economic cost of the war, but Britain also is not necessarily convinced in the 1920s and 1930s that it needs to be fully invested in the balance of power in Europe. That its own status in the world depends on maintaining a certain balance between powers in Europe. Because the British have this alternative. What do you think it is? The British have this other way of saying, this is how we figure in the world. Anyone imagine what that might be?
Economy?
Not quite the economy, it's tied to the economy.
Colonies?
Colonies, yes, they have the British Empire. They've got India and Egypt and Singapore and Malaysia and Burma. They're tied to Australia, Canada, New Zealand, etc. You have this enormous empire. One which in the 1920s and 30s is beginning to be challenged by people like Gandhi. They are beginning to challenge the legitimacy of empire, the legitimacy of colonial rule. So for Britain, the idea is, should we spend our time worrying about Germany, or should we spend our time worrying about propping up our empire? How should we spend government funds? Funds which are, at times in the 20s and 30s, rather limited. And the decision is made that empire is fundamentally more important. So you have these sort of ideas of competing interests in both the United States and in Britain in the 20s and 30s. About their own foreign policy pursuits, about the cost of war, about the potential benefits of war. In both of these countries, you're only going to get to rearmament later on. You're only going to get to sort of a recognition of the threat posed, especially by Nazi Germany, in the late 1930s. And let me talk a little bit now and break down a few specifics about this. I'm going to talk about the British case first, and then talk about the American case. That is about the ways in which people perceived the potential threat from Germany. In the 1920s and 1930s, in Britain, as I said, there is this profound reluctance to use war as a means of settling disputes. In the 1920s, a bunch of countries, including the Germans, the British, and others, will in fact sign a treaty basically outlawing war as a means of settling disputes between nations. The British sign it. I mean, the Germans, everybody signs it. Whether they actually believe it or not is, I think, an open question. But for the British, the mechanisms set up in the 20s and 30s to try to ensure peace have to compete with, or seem at times to conflict with, British interests in the world. Perhaps the most significant of these is the League of Nations. Britain is a charter member of the League of Nations, but they are not necessarily a wholehearted or enthusiastic participant. The whole idea of a League of Nations is a little bit problematic for Britain, because it, in its name alone, it enshrines the principle of national self-determination, that there are such things as nations out there, and that nations need to be protected. That's a very awkward thing for an imperial power to deal with. That is, you wind up saying, well, yes, Czechoslovakia, that's a nation. It turns out it's not. It's actually two nations these days. India, no, not so much a nation. Hungary, a nation. Egypt, not a nation. So you have this sort of balancing act. It's one of the things that it makes it very hard for imperial powers to fight this war. It had made it hard for the British Empire, in some senses, to fight the previous war. You go to war with a lot of rhetoric about freedom, self-determination, liberty, about the need to protect against tyranny and arbitrary rule. It was very hard to square that with colonial possessions. The British and the French tried. They tied themselves in knots at times, trying to justify why they could fight for the national self-determination of the Poles, but could not allow Indians or Irish or others to enjoy their own national sort of political autonomy. So you have this difficulty. The British are in the League of Nations, but they're not 100% committed to the League of Nations. Furthermore, as I've mentioned, in Britain, you have, in the 20s and 30s, a focus on the domestic economy, a focus on doing what is best for reconstructing British industrial and financial influence around the world. There is a lot of opposition among British financiers, among British industrialists in the 1920s and 1930s to doing anything that resembles rearmament. And this comes out of from a couple of different directions. For financiers, rearmament is seen as potentially bad because it might be the government spending money. And if the government is spending money, its budget might not balance. And if the government's budget isn't balanced, people will perceive British currency as weak. They'll perceive the pound as weak. They'll worry about inflation. They'll worry about the value of their investments held in pounds. And they will run from the pound. At a time in which British financiers, British banks, and others are trying to build up or to rebuild their reputation as sort of the center of global financial capitalism, the global financial economy. So you have real reluctance to engage in rearmament there. Among industrialists, there's also reluctance to engage in rearmament. That is, not only if the government were to, for example, spend money on it and necessarily weaken Britain's financial position generally, but more specifically, if the British government decided it wanted to rearm, it would probably start issuing bonds. It would issue securities to raise the money. That is, if they weren't going to, do it out of government revenues and potentially unbalance the budget, they'd have to go raise money, raise capital to do it, issue bonds, other sorts of financial instruments in order to do it. The problem there, these industrialists thought, was that would detract from investment in industry. People wouldn't put their money in industrial shares, in industrial stocks. People instead would put their money in government bonds, which after all were called at times gilts. That is, because sometimes bond certificates issued by Britain had gold gilt edges, or at one time had gold gilt edges, excuse me. And was that sort of signified they were solid. They were based on gold. They were based on sound financial footing in the government. Investing in industrial development, especially new technologies, new manufacturing processes, new products, that's more risky. So industrialists are opposed to rearmament as well. Another aspect of rearmament that industrialists found at least somewhat distasteful, rearmament would draw in and potentially create, it would draw in an enormous amount of labor that had been used during the war but now had gone unused, or sort of labor numbers that were much less in the 20s and 30s than had been during wartime. That might create labor shortages. What that would do, of course, would empower workers. It would give them greater bargaining power, give unions greater bargaining power. It would give them a better position regarding wages and work schedules and things like that. So rearmament, by potentially taking capital and by potentially increasing the size of the labor force or increasing the rate of labor participation, had some risks for industrialists. So even in the 20s and 30s, had people considered rearmament in any significant way in Britain, there would have been opposition. So you have people in Britain who are concerned about the money ought to go to the empire, people ought to think about the empire first. No, even if you're going to think about the empire, you have to have a limit on what you spend and what you borrow and how you borrow. And that we haven't even gotten to the fact that in the early 1930s, there are significant popular demonstrations of anti-war feeling. That is, that in the 1920s, in the early 1930s, there will be famous polls taken, famous sort of votes taken at protests and demonstrations in which the British public, at least those part of it responding to these opinion surveys and others, will emphatically state that war is not the answer. that other issues take priority over the security of Europe. That's another thing to consider. When you look at how British diplomats and politicians approach the question of Italy and Germany from 1934 onward, the rise of the Nazi Party, an expansionist or at least sort of ambitious German state moving again now in Central Europe. When you look at the context, you have to understand that there are significant constituencies arguing that war and rearmament are not popular, or basically declaring that war and rearmament are not the way forward. That is, voters through opinion polls, industrialists, manufacturers, financiers, and others, supporters of empire, all of them are bringing these opinions to bear upon political decision makers. So the idea that somehow from 1934 on, Britain is kidnapped, Britain is sort of taken hostage by a series of weak-willed and cowardly politicians is false. Politicians are, by a rule, not very brave. Let's be honest here. It takes a lot to go out against the popular will, to say, no, this is what is right. I mean, even Roosevelt was constrained in the late 1930s, so they fought to find ways around it. One of the few voices in Britain saying maybe Nazi Germany is more of a threat, maybe German rearmament means that we ought to rearm more quickly, one of those people is Winston Churchill in Britain. But Churchill is not trusted by many people, even within his own political party. Because Churchill had a reputation as someone who switched from issue to issue. Churchill had used up a lot of his political capital trying to portray Gandhi as evil in the early 1930s. People saw Churchill as someone who was willing to split his own party over certain issues for personal gain. That's how he was perceived. So it's not a question that, again, Churchill is the voice of the masses being drowned out by a few elites. Rather, most people in the Conservative Party, the political party that dominates British politics in the 1930s, most people in that party see Churchill as basically a pain. Basically as someone, a gadfly, sometimes they called him. Someone who looked for attention, but was potentially divisive, not someone who represented a majority view in the country. A lot of this is sort of retrospective. Churchill looks good in retrospect. At the time, people making political judgments didn't say, we got to figure out what Churchill is doing and get behind him. So you have a public which demonstrates that it is not entirely eager for war. You have a political class which is not eager to get out far ahead of the public. And you also have, it should be said, you also have some interesting personalities at work. Perhaps the most interesting and significant is the British Prime Minister, a man named Neville Chamberlain. A man who is vilified in history to this day now as the, sort of arch appeaser, but who the historical record reveals to be more of a sort of politician, less of a sort of, weak-willed sort of supplicant to Hitler, but also someone who was, in many ways, completely deluded about Hitler. In 1936, 1937, into early 1938, Hitler, of course, begins to make moves against the rest of Central Europe, indicating that he wants to remilitarize part of the German border with France. By early 1938, marching into and taking over Austria, something many in Austria welcomed. By the summer of 1938, beginning to demand that Czechoslovakia surrender part of its territory called the Sudetenland, which contained a large number of ethnic Germans. Hitler's arguments throughout this period were that he was simply seeking to reunite all ethnic Germans. that the Versailles Treaty had been unfair to Germany, not only in its imposition of reparations, but also by dividing ethnic Germans into multiple, or dividing them or sort of allocating them into multiple states. In Poland, in Austria, in parts of Czechoslovakia, there were German populations, in essence, longing to be reattached to the motherland. And it's actually an argument that found a lot of favor in Europe. That is, people didn't view this as Hitler invading places. They simply said, well, it's all Germans just getting back together. You can't blame them. You know, Versailles was unfair. Look, it put these Germans in part of Czechoslovakia. What are they doing there? Why should there be Germans in this part of Western Poland? Things like that. So you have this, this drive by Hitler, and the assumption by Chamberlain that this is Hitler's goal, the reunification of ethnic Germans, the creation of this, German nation state that had a rationale to it, that had a logic to it. Chamberlain believed that that's what Hitler wanted. Chamberlain had this conviction. Chamberlain tended to be a very sort of pragmatic politician, tended to be somebody who actually had a good sense of how politics in Britain worked, where voters were going. Chamberlain had a reputation as somewhat of a progressive thinker. He came from the city of Birmingham. His family had made their name as being civic reformers in Birmingham, people who had reformed the infrastructure, the sewers, the water, etc., in this English city. So you have this person who's fairly confident in his ability to sort of read people and predict political activity or political behavior. And he applies that to Hitler. But of course, the rules are completely gone when you're dealing with Hitler. But Chamberlain famously told a friend, he said, if I simply sit down with a piece of paper and a pencil with Herr Hitler, we will work something out. Never mind what he actually seems to be saying at these rallies, or, the fact that he's just a very, very strange individual. Chamberlain, sorry? His book, yes, there's that. As I said, no matter what they were saying, no matter what they had indicated they planned to do, Chamberlain believed, look, I will just sit down one rational human being to another, which is a huge mistake when you're dealing with it. Chamberlain, in 1938, is the prime minister. When it becomes apparent, or when it becomes sort of quite likely, or it appears quite likely, that Britain's going to wind up going to war. The League of Nations, and Britain and France in particular, had guaranteed the borders of new states created by the Treaty of Versailles. These included Hungary, Poland, and Czechoslovakia. The German demand for the return of, what they said, the return of the Sudetenland to Germany would violate those borders. So in the summer of 1938, as Hitler ratchets up the pressure, as Nazi-sponsored and inspired Germans within the Sudetenland begin to campaign, at times violently, for the basically the re-annexation of their land by Germany, Chamberlain is faced with a problem. He's got a country which doesn't want to go to war, for a variety of reasons, a country which is ill-prepared to go to war, in any event, and he believes in Hitler, he has someone who has an end in mind, or a finite goal in mind. Hitler does, but it's not the one that Chamberlain thinks he has. So Chamberlain, in September and October 1938, engages in a series of dramatic diplomatic negotiations involving the French, the Germans, and the Czechs. People in London thought by the late summer of 1938 they were going to war. And Chamberlain sort of summed up this confusion and sort of summed up the popular mood when he told Parliament in the summer of 1938, people are confused. He said, why should we be going to war? Why should we be concerned about developments in a country, and this is his famous phrase, in a country far, far away of which we know so little? That is, why should we care about Czechoslovakia? Why should we be fighting about Czechoslovakia? It's not like the Germans are on our doorstep. The Germans just want the other Germans back. That's the public mood. And when Chamberlain goes in September and October 1938 to negotiate with Hitler, he has enormous popular support. When Hitler invites Chamberlain to come in October to Munich, there's this dramatic moment where this messenger runs into Parliament where the House of Commons is meeting and sort of whispers in the ear, and they're debating something else, but Chamberlain is there, and he stands up. He's the Prime Minister, so he gets to interrupt. And he says, I just want everyone to know that I have now been invited and will soon be leaving for an emergency meeting called in Munich. And the place erupts in cheers. Chamberlain's going to keep us out of war. Chamberlain goes off to the airport with cheering crowds. He comes back bearing a piece of paper. Having given the Sudetenland to the Czechs, so the French and Germans did it while the Czechs were out of the room. Chamberlain comes back not only with this agreement to sort of partition Czechoslovakia or give part of it back to the Germans, but also what he believes is a bound or a binding declaration, mutual declaration of non-aggression between Germany and Great Britain. He's waving a piece of paper. He says, I have achieved peace in our time. Chamberlain was terribly bad at predictions. In 1938, he says, I've achieved peace in our time. In the spring of 1940, when Hitler hadn't done anything for a few months, Chamberlain predicted that Hitler was done, and he famously said, Hitler has missed the bus. A week later, Hitler invades France. That was the end of Neville Chamberlain. But Chamberlain comes back, again, cheering crowds at the airport. This is all very dramatic. I mean, Chamberlain flies to Munich, which is now about, it's about an hour and a half flight. It takes him about 8 hours. They have to stop 6 times to refuel. It's this very dramatic thing. It's shown in newsreels, people cheering. He comes back to the House of Commons in Parliament, makes a statement, more cheering. Chamberlain has kept us out of war. So if you look at the German approach, if you look at the British approach in the 1930s, it's one which very much centers on the need to stay out of war. Even Hitler could not quite believe his luck. Over the course of the 1930s, as from 1934 on, he made sort of provocation after provocation towards the European powers, especially France and Britain. Remilitarizing parts of Germany. Demanding the return of parts of other states. Every single time he got his way. Because in France and in Britain you have this reluctance to go to war for multiple reasons. And what's interesting about this is that Hitler in the early 1930s, he did not necessarily, even after he assumed power in 1934, power in 1933 and sort of absolute dictatorship in 1934, there were still factions within the German government, especially in the military. They were not sold on Hitler. They thought of him as a sort of a useful puppet to put up there, someone whose elevation to prime minister would sort of appease the masses, or at least appease this large section of the population that had voted for him. But they didn't think of Hitler as some sort of tactical, strategic, diplomatic genius. But every time in the mid-1930s that Hitler challenged the status quo in Europe, and challenged the most powerful states in Europe, Britain and France, Hitler came out ahead over German rearmament, over remilitarizing parts of Western Germany, over Austria, and ultimately over the Sudetenland. And it helped to contribute to what one, perhaps the most famous and most sort of well-recognized and reputable scholar of the Nazi period has said, he calls it, this is the Hitler myth. That is, Hitler benefits because he's got opponents who really don't want to go to war, opponents who feel that Hitler actually sort of has a case, and the result is Hitler takes all these risks. At a time in which, between 1935 and 1938, at a time in which the German state was not yet nearly as ready to go to war as it would be by the end of 1939. The generals knew that. Some of Hitler's own allies knew that. But every time Hitler won these contests, these diplomatic face-offs with Britain and France, by the end of 1938, you have a lot of people in Germany who think this guy has some sort of, not quite magical power, but this guy has this extraordinary ability to read diplomatic situations, to read power relationships. And what it means is that by 1939, Hitler's able to assume a lot more control of military decision-making with, at times, disastrous results by the middle of the 1940s. But in the late 1930s, the fact that Britain and France demonstrably don't want to go to war with him and back down, so it seems to him, reinforces this sort of idea of Hitler as this sort of, foreign policy genius. And as we've seen, it's not necessarily that the British and the French are cowering before Hitler, but in the case of Neville Chamberlain in particular, he believes he's making rational decisions based on domestic politics, based on what he perceives German foreign policy aims to be. Everyone with me so far? Now, I'm not saying here that Chamberlain ought to be let off from all judgment. Chamberlain was notoriously bad at reading Hitler, or reading anything written by Hitler, as we mentioned. Chamberlain's assumption that he could face off with this man with the strange mustache and all the twitches and the stuff like that, and assume that this is you're just another rational person like me. That seems a little bit ill-founded. But to argue that Chamberlain and his advisors basically took Britain for a ride is something that was invented really in 1940, 1941. As a way of basically excusing much of the British political establishment for its behavior in the 1930s. That is, there had to be some explanation. Why did we all ignore Hitler? Well, it's because Chamberlain sort of hijacked foreign policy. As I said, Chamberlain was supremely confident. He was not only the prime minister, he was also his own foreign minister. Perhaps also in the state. But in the case of Britain, it's only in the spring of 1939 that many in Britain wake up to what the Nazis are up to. In 1938, there's a little bit of a raised awareness after Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, a massive night of violence organized against Jews within Germany, causes international outrage, at which point people, even like Chamberlain, start to say, this is not quite what we anticipated. March 1939, the Germans invade and take over the rest of Czechoslovakia. That was not part of the plan. The Czech government is going to be set up in exile in London from early 1939 on. That's when the British begin to readjust. That's when they make plans to ramp up rearmament. It's also when Chamberlain takes sort of a completely opposite tack diplomatically and strategically. In the spring of 1939, Chamberlain and the British government reach out to and ultimately guarantee the security of Poland. Poland is next, they believe. One of the problems that Chamberlain has is that, again, in the 1930s, looking at the aftermath of the First World War, looking not only at sort of the economic and physical damage and bodily damage that the war had wrought, Chamberlain and others are among those who look at the Soviet Union and say this is another thing that can happen because of war. So even in 1939, as Chamberlain, Britain ultimately guarantee the security of Poland, something they can make all the proclamations in the world they want about. There's no way to move British forces quickly to Poland to defend it. But even the Poles know this. It's a gesture. It's sort of an attempt to sort of draw this line and see whether Hitler would cross it. Of course he did. But even then, in 1939, as the British are reaching out, they don't pay much attention to the Soviets. In the spring and early summer of 1939, the Soviets are willing to talk to the British. As I mentioned before, Stalin is sort of casting around, trying to buy time, trying to reorganize his army. in the post-purge year of 1939. The British largely dismiss Stalin. Stalin is hugely insulted because they don't send an important diplomat to talk to the Soviets. Instead, it's sort of an afterthought. They send an undersecretary from the Foreign Office, somebody who's not very powerful, somebody who's not very notable. Stalin feels snubbed. The British don't have a lot to offer the Soviets. For Chamberlain and others, the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution, still looms large as one of these negative impacts of the First World War. So even as they are guaranteeing Poland, the British, still governed by the impact of the First World War, are only very warily dealing with the Soviets. A group whose existence, or a country whose existence was perhaps the first, or was perhaps really the only check on Hitler's ambitions in Europe because of its size and its resources. So for Chamberlain, it's a case of sort of almost too much, too little, too late. Yes, they guarantee Poland, but it doesn't make any sense. By the time Poland is guaranteed, the German economy, especially the industrial economy, is going full bore. Germany is rearming. Germany is advancing and innovating technologically in the construction of tanks and aircraft in particular. It's almost too late. The guarantee to Poland is, of course, what gets Britain into war. When Germany invades Poland September 1, 1939, Britain is forced, after 2 days, to declare war on the Germans. Not that they can do much for Poland, nor could the French do much for Poland. And the Poles sort of understood this. But they're now in war. Not something Chamberlain had wanted. Not something Chamberlain had ever entertained, even. Not only because of his own personal determination to keep Britain out of war, but also because the politics of it were not very attractive in Britain in the 1930s. The idea of taking a stand is saying, you know, we're going to draw lines, and we will back them up with military force. Chamberlain doesn't see any political value in doing that. And the result is, by 1939, he has very few options left to stand up to Hitler, except for the rather unpalatable one of guaranteeing Polish security and then watching the Germans violate it almost immediately. Any questions about this? So we have a Britain which goes into war in 1939, now with public support and public opinion behind the decision to go to war. But it's a fairly recent development. It's a development only from early 1939 onwards, maybe beginning in November 1938 with Kristallnacht. Chamberlain had come back from his meetings with Hitler in October of 1938, waving the piece of paper and talking about peace in our time. In the American case, there is also significant domestic opposition to war. Not necessarily on sort of, as you might see in Britain, philosophical, ethical opposition to war, but rather more pragmatic opposition to war. That American interests were not best served by getting re-entangled in Europe. And there's a couple of notable moments, I think, that we ought to look at. It's not just the rejection of the League of Nations that marks out this period. But as I've mentioned, it's the conviction, which grows during the 1920s, and then is especially profound, especially powerful in the early 1930s during the Depression, the start of the Depression, that war was simply a means of the rich enriching themselves. That is, the start of the Great Depression, of course, in 1929, sees massive unemployment, massive economic dislocation, migration out of, not just out of the lack of jobs, but out of disastrous environmental conditions, the Dust Bowl years in Oklahoma, parts of Texas, even parts of eastern Colorado. You have real economic collapse, real economic catastrophe. And some in politics believe, in essence, that this economic catastrophe is caused in part by the rapacious capitalism practiced in the 1920s. That is, you have Roosevelt, who ultimately succeeds in arguing that democratic institutions can save the economy, can rehabilitate the free market, but there are others who, especially in the early 1930s, look back at the First World War and say, here is further evidence that the economy is rigged, that people are suffering. There is, in the early 1930s, a very populist turn in American politics. By populist, I don't mean necessarily socialist or even, you might say, politically progressive, but a notion, again, of sort of an us versus them, a notion of the majority of the people being oppressed, being maligned, being disadvantaged by a small group. American populism goes back to the late 19th century with people like William Jennings Bryan. You guys all have heard of him? William Jennings Bryan, please. 1, 2, 3. Bryan, raise your hand. William Jennings Bryan. Okay, what was his famous speech? Anyone remember? 1896 convention. The Cross of Gold speech about American farmers being crucified on a cross, or being, what do you say, executed, something like that. Martyred on the Cross of Gold. The idea that the gold standard, the precious metal standard for currency, was disadvantaging and discouraging American farmers. So you have this populism. It's a populism that takes multiple avenues in this idea that there are sort of elites. Some of the populism does get channeled into Roosevelt's nomination and Roosevelt's eventual victory. The idea that Herbert Hoover represents an out-of-touch small group. The idea that Roosevelt promises bold action, even in the first 100 days of his government. But there's others floating around as well. And these are populists who tend to get, who embrace what you might call most sort of fringe views, but tend to attract followers. They look at the Depression, and they argue this is because of big business. Some of them will begin to veer, not only into sort of characterizing this as sort of the evils of big business, but they'll start to veer into anti-Semitism. The idea that this is not simply about industrialists or economic magnates, but that it's about Jews. It's a view that's espoused by, for among others, Henry Ford. And they will tie their populist vision of this anti-Semitism not only to the argument that basically Jews control global capitalism and are taking advantage of others, but also that it's Jews who want to go to war. The war in both the First World War and the Second World, and any sort of putative war to come, that they will be fought for Jewish economic interests. In some cases, the anti-Semitism is overt, as in the case of Henry Ford. In other cases, it's much more sort of subtle, but it's still there. In the early 1930s, you have a series of politicians who basically argued that in the First World War, the banks and the manufacturers pushed the United States into war. There's a congressman from North Dakota named Gerald Nye, N-Y-E, who has a commission on it. He writes a book called Merchants of Death. In 1935, a retired Marine general named Smedley Butler, don't worry about this name, it's a great name, he writes a book called War is a Racket, which is not in itself an anti-Semitic work, but which plays into this idea that there are somehow business interests pulling the strings. And unsurprisingly, this populist interest in sort of saying, here are elites, here's what they're doing for their own advantage, this helps to propel the movement we think of as American isolationism in the middle and late 1930s. helps to increase in popularity people like Charles Lindbergh and the America First campaign. And I mean, they're not just building on sort of the Depression, too. In the 1920s even, there is a strain of what might be called nativism in American politics. Part of a reaction against going to war, against getting entangled internationally. It plays out in the 1920s, in particular in 1924, with a ban on Asian immigration into the United States, a ban on all Asian immigration into the United States. It'll return in the 1930s with this determination to keep America out of European wars. Because Lindbergh and others rightly perceive that Roosevelt not only doesn't like Hitler, but sees Hitler as a real threat. Roosevelt, some of his advisors, they see Hitler basically as a civilizational threat. That is, Hitler could mean the end of the world. Or at least the end of the so-called civilized world. But it's, even on the eve of war, it's not a popular notion. By 1940, the America First movement has close to 1 million members. They have very vocal supporters. What's interesting about the America First movement is that perhaps its most vocal supporter was the publisher of the Chicago Tribune, a man named Colonel McCormick. And if you plotted membership of the America First movement, it weakened the further you moved from Chicago. That is, the most significant concentration of supporters of the America First movement were within 300 miles of Chicago. Which told you not about the influence of the Chicago Tribune. Remember, that's also the industrial heartland. That's where people are unemployed. People are out of work. It's also significantly a part of the country where there is large-scale, or where there had been large-scale German immigration. And so this combination of populism and ethnicity helps to produce, for example, another group which lobbies against war and seems to have been at least partially funded by the Nazis, called the German-American Bund, the German-American Association or Organization. The German-American Bund holds a rally, basically a sort of a pro-Germany rally at Madison Square Garden in February 1939. They get 22,000 people there. Yeah.
So you said that they're against war, the German-American Bund.
Yeah.
But if they were partly funded by the Nazis, why do you think that they chose to have them against war? Wouldn't you think they want them?
They didn't want the United States to go to war with the Germans.
Okay, so
they're against people. Oh, they are basically they're pro-German and sort of at times only sort of thinly veiled pro-Nazi, and they play up this idea of sort of German ethnic heritage. But they're basically a lobbying group which the Nazis relied on to try to keep the Americans away from war. That is, in Berlin, they did have some money. They didn't have a ton of money to spread around to these groups, but they did have some funding. Now, they're different from the America Firsters. There might have been some cross-membership here, but especially as you moved out of the Midwest, people supporting the German-American Bund tended not to be America Firsters. In the Midwest, you had more sort of cross-registration. And the America First movement was always much, much larger than the German-American Bund. But you do have these significant pressure groups that exist. The America Firsters in particular, and the German-American Bund, I should say also in particular, at times running up to the edge of overt anti-Semitism, are arguing that war is a Jewish plot, that negative publicity about Germans and about Nazi Germany in the United States is a Jewish plot. There's one other element that tends not to be sort of perhaps mentioned as often, but within 300 miles of Chicago, that's a fairly wide radius, a radius of 300 miles all the way around. So diameter of 600 miles, Chicago, for Chicago at the center. You also have, in the late 1930s, a priest named Charles Coughlin. Coughlin is sort of identified, or thinks of himself as the people's priest. He has his own radio show out of Detroit. Again, industrial heartland, massive unemployment. He is someone who initially, in the early 1930s, supports Roosevelt, at least partly, taking on big business, regulating capitalism. But he begins to think of Roosevelt ultimately as sort of a socialist or a Bolshevik even. And by the late 1930s, his rants on the radio, which were heard by tens of thousands of people, his newspapers, which had, again, thousands of subscribers, he'd begun to move into direct sort of anti-Semitic rhetoric, arguing that it was Jewish firms, Jewish families, pulling the levers of power, and that Roosevelt was in their pay, that the New Deal was a farce. He combined this rather sort of this radical economic position with this conviction of sort of a rigged capitalist system, and in particular a perception that it was Jews who had rigged it. And he's very popular. And again, he's in Detroit, so this whole sort of upper Midwest phenomenon exists. And these are very important. These are important states for Roosevelt to carry. Roosevelt presides over this strange, for the 1930s, coalition of northern industrial states and southern agricultural ones. It's one of the reasons why the New Deal is, at times, such a strange amalgamation of things, where they will do things like introduce Social Security, introduce other benefits, things that will eventually become, how should I put it? They will introduce sort of popular public employment programs, things like that. But they won't be found much times in the South. You'll have a huge exemption for agricultural labor from, for example, Social Security, or agricultural employers paying into Social Security. Mostly to do with the fact that you have a very rural South where the bulk of the agricultural laboring population is African American. And in order to get his New Deal program through, Roosevelt's going to have to make some accommodations with, you might say, the Dixie South or the segregated South. It's only in the 1960s, with the Civil Rights Movement and its affiliation with the Democratic Party, that the southern states begin to move from the Democrats to the Republicans. So Roosevelt presides over this sort of strange coalition economically. He's got people pushing at him from these upper Midwest states. Some saying he's not economically radical enough. Some saying he's being controlled by outside, quote-unquote, foreign interests. Whenever somebody in the 1930s started talking about foreign interests, they meant Jews. They didn't mean people from Paraguay, were somehow pulling the strings. Foreign interest was code for Jews. And Roosevelt is hampered a bit. In 1936, and again in 1937, again largely led by Midwestern congressmen and these isolationists, the Congress passes neutrality acts, which says that, for example, U.S. ships can't be used to trade goods with countries involved in war. But U.S. citizens can't trade with countries involved in war. It's these prohibitions that are going to lead Roosevelt to look for all sorts of, you might say, loopholes, workarounds. Most famously being Lend-Lease, which he works out with the British in 1940. Which you can do because you're not selling things. You're loaning them. The British are leasing things. It's not a sale. That is, the Neutrality Acts were all about sale. It took a while. One of the big things was that even with Lend-Lease, you still had to find enough shipping for it. One of the last things to go from the Neutrality Acts was the prohibition on American ships transporting goods. That is, one of the other, even when restrictions are relaxed in 1940 on the sale of goods to nations at war, the policy of Lend-Lease, or part of the policy of Lend-Lease, becomes recharacterized as cash and carry. You can buy the goods, but you've got to take them away. They've got to go on a British ship, a Canadian ship, something not registered in the United States, as a way of getting around sort of some of the prohibitions that remain. So you have, again, in the United States, up until 1941, up until really the actions of the Japanese in China and then in Vietnam in the late 1930s and early 1940s, only then do you have the rethinking or the remaking of the idea of shall we say, a participation in the war. I mean, let's just think about a couple of things. Let me give you a couple of statistics. In 1937, the Gallup poll in the United States surveyed American voters. 70% said the U.S. should have stayed out of World War I. And there was a relationship of that to, in 1938, and sort of the idea, especially the growing anti-Semitic ideas about that war. In 1938, another Gallup poll found that 75% of Americans thought that there should be now a ban on any more Jewish migration into the United States. This is prior to Kristallnacht, but as pressure on Jews in Germany is increasing. It takes a while. And it takes, in particular, this combination of Japanese aggression in East Asia and the Pacific in the late 1930s, and ultimately, not just Hitler's rise to power, even Hitler's invasion of Poland, but Hitler's invasion of much of the rest of Western Europe in May 1940. That starts to shift the tide in the United States. You see Roosevelt asking for more and more money in his military budgets. In 1940, he manages to convince Congress to introduce a peacetime draft. That is peacetime conscription. People had to register for a draft. At the end of 1940, having now been elected for the third time, Roosevelt makes the case that the United States is no longer sort of a passive bystander, but he famously coins the phrase that the United States is now the arsenal of democracy. One of the things that made it easier for Roosevelt was that all of a sudden you weren't, by the end of 1940, fighting for various European powers. It was very hard to sell the American people on fighting for the French or fighting for the Dutch. It was easier to sell them on fighting for Britain. By the end of 1940, Britain is isolated in Europe. The Germans have conquered just about everywhere else in Western Europe and are beginning to turn east, or beginning to turn their thoughts to the east towards the Soviets. Britain remains out. And there is a very public campaign throughout 1940, but especially in the summer and fall of 1940, there's a very public campaign in the American media, in American culture, a campaign which, it turns out later on, was partially funded by the British government. The British government had a huge public information section assigned to New York City, which was specifically tasked with creating and provoking sympathy towards the British. Films depicting British sacrifice, newsreels depicting the Blitz, the Battle of Britain and the ultimate bombing of places like London in late 1940. All of these things get wide play in the United States. It's not enough yet to go to war, but Roosevelt gets enough of a shift in public opinion that even though the America Firsters still have close to 1 million members in 1940, when he makes his argument about arsenal of democracy, about being an arsenal of democracy, he gets a hearing. He's able by 1941 to get the Lend-Lease program going. In fact, by March 1941, the Lend-Lease program has 80% approval. And it's due to a couple of things. In the first place, it's very much framed as not fighting, but as supplying only the arsenal of democracy. And also because of the very concerted campaign by people in the American media, the American news industry, politicians and others, to talk about Britain. That is, it's very hard to get people to fight for Belgium, people from Michigan to fight for Belgium. It's easier to get them to fight for Britain. The idea being that they speak a common language and they share a common heritage. It's a situation that FDR is basically supported not by things he's done on his own, but changes in the world. That is, by 1940, regarding Germany at least, you don't yet have an American population willing to go to war with Germany. That's the big concern. Roosevelt has been able to couch it in certain terms. Arsenal of democracy, lend-lease, cash and carry. All of these things that basically keep war simply at a remove. The British are still desperate to bring the Americans in, but they have no idea how they're going to actually accomplish that. That is, for all of the ways in which Roosevelt is able to shift public opinion by 1940, the idea of actually going to war with Germany is still politically unpalatable to him. There will be, and we'll talk more about a little bit about this on Thursday, there will be rising concern about what the Japanese are doing by the end of the 1930s. There will be an understanding by Roosevelt and others that public opinion for action against the Japanese will be fairly easy to develop. But there's no clear idea about how you're going to make the transition between supplying Britain with material to allying with Britain and fighting alongside Britain. In fact, it's Adolf Hitler who's going to solve this problem for Roosevelt. That is, Roosevelt's declaration of war against Japan right after Pearl Harbor is followed 3 days later by Hitler's declaration of war on the United States, which solves all of Roosevelt's political problems. Roosevelt himself wanted to concentrate on Europe. He himself sort of underestimated, to some extent, the strength of Japan and the extent of Japanese goals in the Pacific. He wanted to concentrate on Europe. He saw Germany as a threat to basically the foundations of the civilized world. And he had no idea how to transmit that to people. He had managed to work some changes in American foreign policy. But it's only when Hitler declares war. That is, there was not enough, shall we say, isolationist sentiment around to say, even if you declare a war against us, we won't go to war with you. That was the final straw. Some members of the German-American Bund found themselves rounded up fairly soon thereafter. But you have, in the late 1941, Roosevelt's problems solved. Again, his problems are solved not by his ability necessarily to persuade the American people, but by developments outside. German invasion of Western Europe, the German isolation of Britain, campaigns done in the United States on behalf of Britain, and ultimately Hitler's decision to sort of unilaterally declare war on the United States. We will leave Europe and talk about Japan next time, and I will see you all on Thursday.